9 to 5 in a job that we hate, molding our minds to serve food on a plate. Wasting our time asking who's to blame. Rush pain claims this is not what we came to the city that says. My mom would always say you are what you make, but the money I made as a bed-wage slave with my own bathtub babe. It's a shot to the grave, a tombstone that says what a beautiful waste of what could have been.
You know, winners write the history books. Everybody, we all know this as radicals. Colonialists, capitalists, imperialists, white men often, and the powerful get to tell the story of how they see things. How do we handle this as anarchists, or how do, if working class people want their story heard, who have so often been history's losers?
Yeah, it's something that is obsessing me. And look, if you have got any listeners, they should really switch off now, because this could get me going for bloody hours. And it's sad, I think, a man of my age being obsessed like this. Perhaps I feel my own mortality. There's 2 or 3 things, I think, that I'd want to say. One is that, yes, you're right. There's no question. No one can argue with a word you're saying. You're absolutely spot on. However, the same argument applies to the histories of anarchism, even written by anarchists themselves. And thirdly, it applies to us today who look for patterns and beautiful symmetry that isn't there. I'll try and give a couple of examples if I can. I've just written about a man called Matt Cavanagh. And Matt Cavanagh died in the early 50s in England. And in his obituary, it says that he was probably one of the most well-known anarchists in England and Scotland and Ireland. He was an Irish militant. He spoke at many meetings talking about anarchism, talking about anarchist ideas. In actual fact, it's quite possible that more people became anarchists listening to Matt than they ever did reading Kropotkin or Emma Goldman or Bakunin. Matt, if you like, was the man, the person who put himself in between Kropotkin and his audience, and he would try and explain those ideas. He worked a lot of his time on a building site, labourer, building houses and factories and such forth. And there's no doubt that a lot of his writings, if you were to look for him in Freedom, are very straightforward explanations, almost, I think, mirroring the conversations he must have had every day, because he was an agitator wherever he went. The one thing we know about Cavanagh is that he kept anarchism alive in England in its really dog days. He was responsible for keeping it going, talking about it, arguing about it incessantly where he worked and at meetings. In America, if you look at a guy called Haim Weinberg, the same can be applied to him. Robert Helms has just helped edit his memoirs, and he's exactly the same as Matt. He's a man who went out, spoke, was uplifting, funny. He was, I think, more of a star than Matt was. Matt was not a performer in that sense, though he could be funny and dry. But the point is that those 2 guys introduced masses of people to anarchism and to what anarchism was. And if you read histories of anarchism, you won't find their names.
Sure.
If you read George Woodcock's anarchism, you read Peter Marshall's Demanding the Impossible, they're not there. But people who are there are those people who can write. Those people can write, if not elegantly, at least in a straightforward manner. And they can convey ideas. And because they write, because they're able to write, and because, honestly and truthfully, most of them are middle class or upper class, they are given precedence over the day-to-day activities of people like Cavanagh. Now, I think that's shocking, and I think it's absolutely shocking that we as anarchists allow that to be the case in our culture. Look, whoever's listening to this knows full well that that every bloody day, well, let me give you an example. The San Francisco Anarchist Book Fair happens every year, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I try most years to get there and set it up early. And every year there's often the same people there, just putting out the tables, putting out the chairs, making sure that when they come, people turn up, they've got somewhere to sit, they've got a table, the chairs are ready for the speakers. They make anarchism work. If you look at people you know, those people who just get on with it and do it, you know who you can rely on. You know who keeps a group together or breaks it up. You know who makes sure that the paper comes out or the phone call's made. They're the people who keep our movement going. And yet our history isn't flexible enough. It's still, if you like, dominated by a certain narrative of history that we're not giving those people credibility. And yet they're the people who we respect in our own way. And they're the people who keep those ideas alive and that practice alive. And even if they bloody irritate us and get on our nerves, we respect them. And if they're lost and their ideas and their thoughts and their practices are lost, all we do is just keep reinventing the wheel and read more and more theory that takes us to the edge of the abyss of craziness.
So really, anarchists' most important history, in your view, could in fact be an oral history.
Well, it can be an oral history, or it can be in the glimpses of pieces of letters or memories or papers. If you were to read I Couldn't Paint Golden Angels, and you look at Albert Meltzer's memories, and they ask him, who's the most important anarchist influence in your life? And he says, Billy Campbell. And Billy Campbell was an anarchist in you, who actually went down with the ship during World War II. And it was Billy's attitude to life and his behavior and his way of living and being that influenced Albert far more than any book or writing ever did. And if we can find those traces, if we can find those, working class women anarchists, Kate Sharpley, who have disappeared from history, if we can somehow bring them back, I fear and I feel that we're going to get a different narrative of anarchism. And I think the narrative of anarchism we're going to get is going to challenge maybe a lot of our ideas and practices.
That may be a good segue for. Why don't you tell us about who Sharpley was, Kate Sharpley, and then maybe segue into talking about the Kate Sharpley Library Project in general.
In segue a musical term. I thought we were going to segue into me singing It's Not Unusual or something then,
Barry, I really think that you want to sing tonight, I think.
Yeah, I really do actually, but I'm not going to, because my son could be listening to this program in New Zealand and I couldn't live with the shame. Kate Sharpley, well, Albert Meltzer met her in a pub in England, in South London. During World War I, when a member of your family had been killed in the war in England, someone rather prestigious would present members of the family with a big medal. I've got a couple from my great uncles, and it says on, he died for king and country, and his name's on the other side. And Kate Sharpley's brother was killed somewhere in World War I. And she was at a presentation ceremony in South London, and she'd been around the local anarchist group. And I think it was the aunt of the Queen or some such who came up to her and offered her the medal. And Kate Sharpley threw it and said, take your fucking medal back. And it seemed to me a remarkably brave thing to do, because this was a period where, you were going to go to prison if you did that. And she, I think, was certainly charged, and I'm not sure if she did go to prison. I do know that her life was made hell. She had to leave the area because the police were sort of following her and accusing her of street walking and all sorts of crimes. And Albert, as I say, met her, chatted to her. She was very impressed with groups like Class War, who felt they had the right idea of just militant confrontation. And Albert, was, I think, quite moved by this. And you understand that I didn't quite understand it, really, I mean, I knew something was wrong with anarchist history, And I knew someone was wrong even with anarchist writings, but I didn't. So if I sound like knowledgeable now, I wasn't then. This was in the 80s. I didn't understand it. But Albert decided to try and create and collect anarchist pamphlets, letters, photographs, newspapers. And he wanted to call it the Kate Sharpley Library. And he wanted to do this because he felt that the histories of anarchism were lopsided. And there was a great, great gap in them. And here's this working class young woman who isn't available anywhere. You don't know anything about her. You don't find her. You can't see her. Yet she lived and she breathed. And she took on people in a public way that many of us might be frightened to do. And she suffered for doing it. But she's gone. She's not there anymore. And he thought this was exactly the right title to call the archive. And he and others started to collect material and to build it up. And to try and say, look, no one's going to razz on Kropotkin or Bakunin or Goldman or Voltaire and declare, but there is another story. And if we collect it, maybe people will be able to read it and find it. And the other thing was that, I again didn't quite understand this. He got really, really angry with anarchists who would give their material to state universities or state research archives. He just couldn't understand that. And Stewart, in fact, had done it to get rid of them, but he took them back from Amsterdam and presented all of his books and papers and letters to the Kate Sharpley. So out of Kate Sharpley came this archive, which is run in a collective way. It's based in California. And people are always welcome to come and look at it any time or to ask for information. We're now, or very soon, going to have a full-time unpaid worker. I should say that all its money comes from comrades. Nobody, works full-time. There ain't no money in it anyway, but we buy what we can, we ask for what we can. And all we urge people to do is to read our material, read, the pamphlets. We try and talk about people who aren't known, and maybe in the movement as they should be, and maybe from all of that we can trace different histories. I'll finish in a second because I'm getting very tired, but I will say I remember reading Appeal to the Young by Kropotkin when I was about 22, 23. And I've been maybe a militant, a radical anarchist for about 5 years till I read that bloody thing. And I remember reading it thinking, I don't know, this is a bit weird. I read it again about 10 years ago. I mean, really read it. I was appalled by it. This missive to the middle-class professionals to care about the poor, helpless people. And it really, really threw me. And it was really just after around the time that Albert died, I read it again, so it's actually about 15 years ago, that I sort of twigged what Albert had been about with Kate Sharpley. The old boy had got it right. Trust me, Albert got a lot wrong. But this he got right.
Nine to five.